On the Titanic, were third-class passengers really locked below decks like this? No, the movie lied to you. There's no evidence whatsoever that third-class passengers were intentionally kept from going to the lifeboats like they show in the movie. However, there were indeed different types of gates used throughout the ship, so let me explain. So we do know that some of these Boswick gates and other barriers were used in certain parts of the ship, but that was only to clearly mark areas that were not for third class. Every class was designated their own area. Also, to comply with immigration laws at the time, ships had to separate third class passengers. It wasn't to keep them trapped. Also, many of the gates were waist high that could be easily jumped over like we see in this deleted scene of the movie. Also, in an emergency, third class had access to first and second class stairwells. This is Scotland Road leading into the first class area. That being said, it was much harder for third class to get up to the boats because they had to navigate this maze of corridors. And many who did make it up found that by the time they got there, the majority of the boats were already gone. Let's talk about Titanic's swimming pool. The swimming pool or swimming bath on the Titanic was kind of a big deal because it was one of the first swimming pools to be installed on an ocean liner. The pool was filled with salt water and kept at a comfortable room temperature, heated by the boilers just below. It was only accessible to first class passengers, and from 10 a.m. to 1 p.m. it was women only, and then 2 to 6 p.m. it was men only, because they were not allowed to swim together. All the pictures of the pool that you see are from Titanic's sister ship, the Olympic. There are none from the Titanic, but I will give you a tour from the Titanic Honor and Glory animation. So the pool was located on F deck on the starboard side of the ship, and it was connected to the Turkish baths. So passengers would enter the Turkish baths, they'd get pampered, and then they'd have direct access to the pool. There were several little change rooms here on the side, and passengers could just come here and relax and take a swim. Little did they know they'd be able to take a swim just a few days later. And yes, I know, the pool is still full to this day. Did you know that the Titanic had a squash court? That's right, they didn't have enough lifeboats, but they did have a squash court. And I'm going to take you on a little tour. So the court was located on G deck, deep within the ship, and was available only to first class passengers. It cost 50 cents to use, and the court supervisor would provide passengers with rackets and balls. The squash court could only be accessed from D deck. This is from the Titanic Honor and Glory animation, so they'd have to take the stairs, descend 3 decks, pass the viewing gallery on F deck, go around until they finally made it to the squash court on G deck. And here passengers could book 1-hour sessions while their friends watched them from a deck above. Now here's an interesting story. Colonel Archibald Gracie, a Titanic survivor, played by this guy in the movie, he was supposed to play squash with the court supervisor on Monday morning. However, when the ship hit the iceberg on Sunday night, the colonel bumped into the supervisor and jokingly said, "Hey, maybe we should cancel the match tomorrow morning." The supervisor, who had already seen water in the squash court, was like, Of course that match never happened because this is a squash court today. Ooh, this is a great question. Were Titanic passengers given a map of the ship? No, they weren't, at least not to my knowledge, but there were maps posted throughout many public areas of the ship. Let me show you here on the Titanic Honor and Glory animation. So as you can see here, this is a map of C deck showing all of the cabins on this deck, as well as a basic floor plan as to the other amenities they'll find on that deck. You can also see the grand staircase. They could also just wander to the public areas of the ship. A lot of these people were avid travelers, so they would have a basic idea as to where facilities may be found from traveling on other ocean liners. There were also many signs all over the ship, so as long as they could read, they could get the information. And of course, passengers could ask their stewards or their stewardesses to help them navigate the ship. And shout out to you guys if you recognize where this clip is from. So regardless of class, passengers would often just ask crew members to tell them where the heck to go. Did you know there was a famous movie star on the Titanic who survived and starred in the very first Titanic movie just a month after the sinking? This is Dorothy Gibson, a famous silent film actress and model, and she lived a pretty wild life, as you're about to see. So Dorothy and her mom were on vacation in Europe when they boarded the Titanic as first-class passengers. On the night of the sinking, they were rescued on the very first lifeboat to be launched, lifeboat number 7. And upon arriving in New York, her film company convinced her to star in a movie about the disaster. She ended up co-writing the movie called Saved from the Titanic, and she played herself, and she even wore the clothes that she wore the night of the sinking. The silent film was released only 29 days after the sinking, and it was a huge success. But unfortunately, all the copies of the movie were burned in a fire in 1914. Later, her affair with a married film producer was exposed when she was driving his car and then she struck and killed somebody. The guy divorced his wife, married Dorothy, and then they got divorced. And later during the war, she was a Nazi spy, switched sides, ended up in jail, and then eventually died of a heart attack. So were there any Titanic survivors that were able to watch the movie? Yes, there actually were. When Titanic premiered in December of 1997, there were 7 survivors still alive, and 2 of them did in fact see the movie. The first was Eleanor Johnson Schumann, who was only a year and a half old when she was on the Titanic, and she was the only one who actually met director James Cameron while filming Titanic. She got a special screening to watch the movie in Chicago, and she ended up watching the movie 3 times and cried every single time. And she passed away just a few months later at the age of 87. The second survivor to watch the movie was Michel Navratil, and you may recognize him as one of the famous Titanic orphans. This is Michel here with his brother before being reunited with their mother. Unlike Eleanor, Michel didn't watch the movie until a couple of years afterwards in the comfort of his own home. His daughter later said that he was quite moved and he had tears in his eyes the whole time. He passed away in January of 2001 at the age of 92. Okay guys, so many of you tagged me in this video of the Titanic Mansion asking me if it was true, and I can confirm, yes, it is true. It belonged to American millionaire Peter Widener, who was an investor of the Titanic, and his son, George Widener, was a first-class passenger on the Titanic, traveling with his son Harry and his wife Eleanor. On the night of the sinking, the Widners had a dinner party with Captain E.J. Smith, and after the collision, George and Harry put Eleanor into lifeboat number 4, and they sadly perished. And this is Linwood Hall. As many of you know, all the Titanic survivors are now dead. But there is one survivor that's rarely ever talked about, and that's this lady here, Lillian Asplund. Now, she's very interesting because she was the last survivor with actual living memories of the disaster. And even though she was the last person with actual memories of the disaster, she spent pretty much her whole life trying to forget those memories. So this is her story. Lillian boarded the Titanic with her mother and her father and her 4 brothers, and they were all heading back to the US. She vividly recalls being passed through a window of the A-deck promenade, so that would have been right here, and looking up and seeing her father and her 3 other brothers still on deck. And she said that their faces haunted her for the rest of her life. Lillian survived the sinking with her mother and one of her brothers, and they were all pretty traumatized for the rest of their lives. Now, when Lillian passed away in 2006 at the age of 99, they discovered a box full of Titanic artifacts that no one had seen before, which included an original copy of their Titanic ticket. What were some of the traumas that Titanic survivors encountered? Great question. There was a lot of post-traumatic stress disorder, as you can imagine, for both passengers and crew. And it was actually especially difficult for a lot of the crew. So take, for example, Quartermaster Hitchens. So this is the guy in the movie that you may recognize. He was the person at the helm when Titanic hit the iceberg. You may remember that in the movie, he's portrayed as the guy who says to Molly Brown, "Shut that hole in your face." And he was largely remembered that way in history as kind of a coward in the lifeboats and also the guy at the wheel when Titanic hit the iceberg. And sadly, Quartermaster Robert Hitchens was at the peak of his career on the Titanic, and it all went downhill afterwards. He suffered a lot of anxiety because of the way the media treated him, and he was also accused by some of turning Titanic the wrong way. Later in life, his other fellow sailors would accuse him of being a bad omen or bad luck. He became a heavy drinker, his marriage fell apart, he spiraled into a deep depression, and he ended up shooting a guy and went to jail for 4 years. And sadly, he died just a few years after his release. Here is some breaking Titanic news. If you guys haven't heard yet, there was recently a collapse at the Titanic Museum in Pigeon Forge, Tennessee. USA Today and other news outlets report that Titanic Museum iceberg wall collapses in Pigeon Forge, Tennessee, injuring 3 visitors. NBC writes, a wall of ice at the Titanic Museum attraction in Tennessee collapsed and injured 3 guests. Those harmed were taken to the hospital, and the owners of the Titanic Museum announced it in a Facebook post. And this is the Facebook post where they announced that the iceberg wall collapsed and that the 3 individuals were taken to the hospital. And if you're wondering, the iceberg wall they're referring to is not the one outside, but there's one inside that guests can touch and they can feel how cold the ice was. I know a lot of you have actually been to the museum. And the museum closed on Monday, but then reopened on Tuesday, August 3rd, and they estimate that it will take at least 4 weeks to rebuild the wall of ice. So there you go. If you're going to Titanic Museum soon, be gentle with the ice, okay? What's good, Titanic nerds? It's Raph the Titanic Guy Avila here. Thank you so much for watching this TikTok compilation. If you guys enjoyed the video, please don't forget to drop a like and to subscribe to the channel and join our community of Titanic nerds. Also, let me know down in the comments, was there enough room for Jack on the door or the piece of wood, or was Rose just being selfish? Let me know. Also, don't forget to click some of these links here. Some of these videos are really, really cool. I think you're gonna like them, or don't. I can't force you to do anything. Okay, thanks for watching. Bye.